Same in the election campaign. Scarcely a word about the issue that's merely the most crucial one in all of human history. Actually, hardly a day passes without more information about the severity and imminence of the threat. So a couple of days after the New York Times article, a study appeared in Nature showing that retention of heat in the oceans has been greatly underestimated, which means that the total carbon budget, the amount of carbon we can use without total disaster, is much less than was assumed in the already ominous IPCC report. A study calculates that maximum emissions would have to be reduced by 25% to avoid warming of 2 degrees centigrade, which is well above the danger point. At the same time, polls show that half of Republicans deny that global warming is even taking place. And of the rest, almost half reject any human responsibility. And no doubt they are influenced by their leaders, who they trust more than the media. It's a major achievement of today's Republican Party, which, as I've said before, is the most dangerous organization in human history. I concede that that's an outrageous statement, which regrettably happens to be true. It's hard to describe, to find words to describe what is happening before our eyes. And the same is true of the second existential threat, nuclear war. A few weeks before the election, as you know, Trump announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the INF Treaty. The treaty, Reagan-Gorbachev Treaty, eliminated short-range missiles deployed in Western Europe and Russia. And missiles that are extremely hazardous because they have only a few minutes flight time to Moscow. That poses a decapitation threat of destroying any capacity to retaliate. Of course, that sharply increases the danger of a massive nuclear response to warnings given by automated systems that have often failed in the past. And that would end all of it. Anyone familiar with the record knows that it's a virtual miracle that we've so far avoided nuclear war. And miracles you can't count on going on. Now, the threat that was already grave was heightened by the Trump nuclear posture review that authorized new destabilizing weapons, and it lowered the threshold for nuclear attack. And this latest move, withdrawing from the INF Treaty, increases the threat further. Again, scarcely a mention on the campaign trail or in coverage. The U.S. is withdrawing from the treaty on the grounds that China is not a partner and that the Russians have violated it. The Russians, in turn, claim that the U.S. has violated it. It's quite obvious how to address these problems through inspections and diplomacy, neither of which have been attempted. Rather, let's just blithely increase the threat of total destruction. And let's ignore all of this and the vast outpourings during the political campaign. Well, let's put aside the most significant questions in human history and return to what is considered within the realm of discourse. The election once again demonstrated the failure of the Democratic Party to deal with issues that matter to working people. Even more than before, the Democrats lost the non-college educated white population. On the surface, it seems that this can be attributed to the success of Trump's racist, xenophobic, appeals. There was success, which does tell us something about the society. As you may recall, Trump was pulling a leaf from Ronald Reagan's playbook. Back in 1985, our brave cowboy leader strapped on his boots, declared a national emergency because Nicaraguan forces were only 2 days' march from Arlington, Texas, and people didn't collapse in laughter. And it's the same when Trump warns that if some of the women and children fleeing it from misery and oppression actually reach our borders, they'll all try to kill us. Misery and oppression for which we happen to be largely responsible, but put that aside. So it's necessary for heavily armed militias to travel to the border to back up the 15,000 troops sent there to defend us. And amazingly, it seems to have worked. The surveys report that people did vote for Trump because he's the only one who can save us from destruction by these criminal hordes. Now, that does carry lessons. And when we ask why it works, I think we find something deeper, something which is pretty much worldwide. Particularities from place to place, but some fundamental similarities. So keep to the United States. In the U.S., working class people have suffered 40 years of stagnation, while wealth concentrates in very few hands. But the Democrats have not only ignored all this, worse than that, they've carried forward the neoliberal policies that took off with Reagan and Thatcher and have imposed these consequences by design. From the perspective of the designers, the neoliberal programs have been a brilliant success. Inequality has reached staggering levels. I'm sure you've all heard the numbers. Top 1.1% of the population now have as much wealth as the bottom 50%, a great many of whom have practically zero wealth. The rules of corporate governance were changed in ways that allowed executive compensation to soar by 1,000% since 1978. Meanwhile, real wages for non-supervisory workers have actually declined, and it continues under Trump. Despite low unemployment, the wage growth, which did rise a little in 2014 and 15, is now declining. It is now no longer even keeping up with inflation, which means real wages are stagnant or declining during the period of extremely low unemployment. Unions have been subjected to bitter attack by a combined offensive by the state and private capital, with the help of the most reactionary Supreme Court in living memory, getting worse. Financial institutions have exploded in scale. They have also changed radically from service to the real economy, as was the case during the great growth period of the 50s and the 60s, to now speculation and risk with enormous profit. They've reached 40% of corporate profits before the crash 10 years ago, the crash for which they were largely responsible. Deregulation under Reagan and Clinton and beyond, right at once, it led to financial crises. There had not been any before under New Deal regulation. Each one is more severe than the last. But that's no problem for the perpetrators. They're very handsomely supported by the taxpayer, not just by the highly publicized bailouts, but also by more subtle and significant means, such as access to cheap credit and inflated credit ratings, thanks to the tacit government insurance policy. Now, that's actually the source of most of the wealth of the great banks. according to an IMF study. Well, from the crashes, the financial institutions emerged richer, more powerful than before, while the victims suffered. And a side effect of great significance is that the country's wealth is being shifted from research and development, innovation, product development, to financial transactions in the interest of the very rich, which is fine for the super rich, but disastrous for the health and the future of the society. These socioeconomic achievements have been accompanied by doctrinal ones. To see how far elite ideology has shifted to the right during the neoliberal years, it's useful to look back to what was considered conservatism a few years earlier. The views of President Eisenhower, for example. So here's Eisenhower. I have no use for those, regardless of their political party, who hold some foolish dream of spinning the clock back to days when unorganized labor was a huddled, almost helpless mass. Only a handful of unreconstructed reactionaries harbor the ugly thought of breaking unions. Only a fool would try to deprive working men and women of the right to join the union of their choice. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, to eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are a few Texas oil millionaires and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible and they are stupid. That's conservatism, the vintage 1950s.